Our second scripture today is from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 26, verses 1 to 11. When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of the first of all of the fruit of the ground which you harvest from the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall put it in a basket, and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. You shall go to the priest who is in office at the time, and say to him, "Today I declare to the Lord our God that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us." When the priest takes the basket from your hand and sets it down before the altar of the Lord your God, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number. There he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. You shall set it down before the Lord your God and bow down before the Lord your God. Then you, together with the Levites and the aliens who reside among you, shall celebrate with all the bounty that the Lord your God has given to you and to your house. Most scripture passages are pregnant with multiple sermons, and this one is no exception to that. And there's one that, as I read it, is as obvious as it could possibly be, and indeed timely. There was a word there that I'm betting jumped out each time I read it, and that word was alien. And it is a sermon that I could easily preach here. The backstory of it is that the people in this passage at this point were getting ready to enter the promised land. And Moses is giving his farewell address. You remember, Moses wasn't allowed to come into the promised land with the people. So he's getting them ready for what will happen once they're there. And he reminds them that they were once aliens and had been treated badly, and that when they were aliens and treated badly, God intervened and set them on the path to the promised land. Here and in multiple other places through the Old Testament, the Hebrew people are reminded of that fact. You were aliens in foreign lands, therefore you must treat the aliens well. The implication is clear. If they don't, God may intervene yet again on the behalf of the aliens being treated badly, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of that intervention. Of course, it's deeper than that. It's not just that they're to treat the aliens well because if they don't, God's going to get them for it. There's also the fact that they are to identify with the aliens because you are them, and so treat them well. It's an obvious and valid way to go with this passage. Indeed, it is a prominent theme in the Old Testament. And it comes up again and again and again and again. It's at the center of worship and ethics, and it's timely for us. It's an issue that we struggle with as a nation, and there's a bunch of sermons there. I'm not going to go that way. It's there. You can wrestle with it, and you should wrestle with it. It's important. But there's another theme it's clearly related to that, but I think it's one that I wanted to wrestle with for all of us a little bit today. And that is that the faith and the ethics of the Hebrew people is always rooted in their stories, in their memories of what God had done. The bottom line for them is, again and again, never forget where you came from or how you got where you are. And as long as you do that, as long as you hold on to those stories, as long as you remember where your roots are, you're going to be okay. Moses is clearly anticipating a time here when the Hebrew people might identify with Frank Sinatra. I did it my way. After years or generations of hard work, and indeed, if you know the story of the book of Deuteronomy, it's the second law. It gets found centuries later. When they're rebuilding the temple, they find this book and they pull it out. And there really is this second setting for it of looking at the people who've been in the promised land for generations. And like for Moses, they needed to hear this reminder that after generations and years of hard work, it's easy to forget the role of God in everything that happened. Here they are, they're in the land, they've been raising families, they've been farming, they've been caring for livestock, they've been working hard, and they've been making it work, at least some of them. And for those folk for whom it has paid off, they're doing quite well. Thank you very much. The land did indeed, for many of them, flow with milk and honey, and it is all too easy for them to take complete responsibility for all of that on their own. Indeed, I did it my way. And I deserve all of the results of that and all of the praise for everything that's happened. And of course, there is the flip side of that, of anyone who isn't doing well, or who isn't well off, who doesn't have a large and vital family, whose livestock are sickly or died off, they are lazy at best or at worst sinners. And this passage is meant to disarm that even before they get there. Every time they bring their gifts to God, they are to do this recitation. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor, went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, became a great nation, mighty and populous, only to be mistreated by the Egyptians. And then we cried to the Lord, and when we cried to the Lord intervened. Brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, displays of miracles and power, and brought us to this place. Gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first fruits of that ground, because God has given it to me. My ancestors, the person is saying, every time they make an offering. My ancestors were homeless. My ancestors were wanderers. They became slaves, oppressed by foreigners. They cried out to God, who intervened, set us free, and led us to this place. Enabled new possibilities. God brought me here, and I give my first fruits in response. It's hard to have a swelled head if you remember your ancestors were homeless and needed God to intervene. You can't congratulate yourself on your business acumen when it's clear that you were relying on the grace of God. You can't turn away from the needy and the poor and the marginalized when your family was in exactly the same place. And got out of that place only because God gave you a hand up. And then the one who had this history of homelessness, slavery, oppression, is given new hope and new possibilities, gives out of joy and in faith. And it goes on in all of the laws and the rules for how they live together, all of the society's interrelationships and its faith, the rules for living are all summed up in this one short reminder. Don't forget where you came from. Don't forget where you came from. Now, there's another litany in Jewish practice that I really like, and it grows out of this same idea. And in this litany, the leader recites the blessings of God one at a time, and after each one, the congregation responds, that would have been enough. That would have been enough. God led us out of Egypt. That would have been enough. But God did more. God fed us with manna and quail in the desert. That would have been enough. But God did more. Led us into a land flowing with milk and honey. That would have been enough. And on the litany goes. Each response reminding the people of God's blessings and the fact that God always does more. God always does more. There's always more yet to come. And their worship and their ethical framework as a society are based on these stories, these reminders of the very grace and love of God. Clearly, the stories always become more complicated, don't they? Times came after this when the people were less than what they were supposed to be. And when those times came, they didn't need deliverance, they needed forgiveness. And they received that as well. But underneath it is always the sense that their call is to live up to the best parts of the story, with all of the implications that had. And they were to become a light to the nations. The people who showed the entire world how we live together as God's people, relying on the grace and gifts of God. Yes, there would be times, not only when they failed, but also those times when unexplained problems, when illness and natural disasters would come, and the explained ones, the times of human sin and the natural processes of life going on, and that would bring pain and despair. But the stories remind them, even then, God is with you. And you can get through it because you never walk alone. The people cried out to God when they were in slavery in Egypt, and indeed, God heard their cries and intervened. Their stories would remind them of who they were, where they came from, and so enable them to be the people they were supposed to be. Stories are important. Stories are important because they tell us where we came from. They tell us how we got where we are. And our stories are long and complicated, aren't they? We can look around here and you can see that many of us had ancestors who came to this country as indentured servants. Some others came because they were seeking a better life for themselves, for their families, their children, and their descendants. Basically, none of them came here because it sounded like a wonderful thing to just try out for a while and then go back home. That wasn't an option. Some of us, I don't see any here necessarily, but some folk came here chained in the bottom of slave ships. And indeed, still carry some of those scars in our nation. Some of us have little hints of genetic material of folk who lived here before. Those folk came on the boats, whether by choice or not. And that genetic pool, those indigenous people watched as their homes and their culture were stolen from them. It's a complicated story. But in and through it all, there was some sense of seeking a land of milk and honey, a better life. And in spite of all of the evil that was part of that story, and you can't hide from it, and there's no need to hide from it, there's also a sense that there was a dream that held something amazing and wonderful, and had implications that were bigger than any of those folk who hatched that dream ever imagined. You know, when they talked about freedom and equality for all men, they didn't imagine that that also meant people of color. Or that it even meant, dare I say it, women. But the implication was there in the dream. And as we moved forward through our stories, suddenly we saw that dream, that beginning of the story, that's bigger than anybody ever imagined. And how wonderful it is as we allow it to take shape in and through us. And we have faith stories too. Not many of us here grew up as Baptists, but I would argue that story is the story that is most consonant with our American story. And when Martin Marty says that every Christian in the United States thinks they're a Baptist, he's really reflecting that. You know, those ideas that the early Baptists said, you know what? We believe in soul liberty. That you have a responsibility to work out your faith between you and God, and nobody can tell you what that's supposed to look like. Boy, that sounds like an American idea, doesn't it? Doesn't it? And when we make a church together, there's nobody from outside that can tell us how we are to believe or how we're to live out our faith. We're going to figure that out as a community of believers together. And the Bible, that's a complicated book. You can't tell me what it means. I got to figure that out for myself. And most importantly of all, those early Baptists, along with the Quakers and the Unitarians, both of whom were pretty closely related to the Baptists, said, yeah, the government is not going to stick its nose in our faith. And we're going to separate faith and religion, or religion and politics, not because we don't want to have our religion influence our politics, but because our politics can't influence our religion. The government's got to keep its nose out. Can't force us to believe or act in ways that go against our conscience. So we've got that beginning of a story, and it's important to hold on to that and to remember that, and to remember those early Baptists who stood up, and many continue to stand up for folk of other faith traditions and say, no, you can't impose on them. And then we come to our personal faith stories. Mine has been down some crazy detours. I can tell you my story, and there's lots of parts of it that I would say, that was a really good place to be from. But it's not a good place to be any longer. And I can tell you about the folk in my life who have challenged me and changed my faith. Many of them, I don't think even know they did it. But just by being there and living their lives of faith, they made me see my story in new ways. Some supported me, As I said, some challenged me, some hurt me. Some hurt me. And some put my faith in a place where, I wasn't sure anymore because of those people. But all of that story together brings me to where I am. And you have your story. And it brings you to a place, sometimes of milk and honey, sometimes not. But regardless, each of us can stand here and say that as we have walked that journey, as our story has taken shape, that God has been there with us in it and through it all. And Moses here, as he's reminding the Hebrew children, never forget where you came from, Moses reminds us of that same thing. Never forget where we came from. And that knowledge shapes our faith, shapes our relationship with God, but also shapes our relationship with other people. And it requires us to treat others with generosity of spirit, even when they are in places that we cannot affirm. Because, frankly, I've been in places that I cannot affirm. And if I were to have to be held up to different events in my story, I would be very embarrassed. And if I point back at them and tell you about them, the only reason I would do that would be to tell you, I'm glad I'm not there any longer. And indeed, it was a good place to be from. And our ethics then are also based on our stories of forgiveness and of love and generosity. Knowing that the blessings we enjoy are in a very real sense, literally just that, blessings. Received by grace, and sometimes by chance. I didn't have any volition in the fact that I was born a middle-class white boy in a blue-collar workers' paradise, Pittsburgh, back in the day when the steel mills and the unions were strong. I had no choice in that. It just happened. And then the stories remind us that the story continues on. Corwin, every now and again, gets in this really annoying place where he starts to sing, "This is the song that never ends. It goes on, my friend." And on he goes until you just want to throttle him. But our stories aren't ended. We're not at the final place until we're at the final place. And I'm not sure we're at the final place even then. But the story goes on, and we grow, and we change. And there will be a point 75 years from now when I'll look back and I'll say, that was a good place to be from. I'm glad I'm not there anymore, because I've learned and grown and changed and experienced life in new ways and see things through new eyes. You know, as I've been reading David's book, I've been very conscious about other folk in this congregation reading that book and the struggle that you may be having with it. I don't know, I'm maybe speaking out of turn. But I remember back when I was doing my doctoral studies, and one of the classes we read some of James Cone's books. James Cone is a prominent African-American theologian. And he talks about white people. Not in a good way. And I remember really being angry about that. And getting up on my hind legs and just because I felt like he was attacking me personally. And in some ways he was. But, you know, now I look back and I go, well, yeah, he was right. He was right. And I thought I was woke at that point. Didn't know what the word meant. But I thought I was. But I grew. And we continue to grow. Because life is a journey, and each one of us will find ourselves seeing things in new ways as we have new experiences. And the call that Moses puts here before us is always do that with generosity. Not only for other people, but even for ourselves, to always be generous with ourselves. So yeah, my ancestors, they were aliens. And sometimes even I'm still not where I need to be. Each of our litanies is going to be slightly different. As we bring our offerings, our first fruits, and lay them before God, I don't know about you, but I'm not going to say, my ancestor was a wandering Aramean. No, my ancestor was probably some royalty in the Stuart clan who had unprotected sex with someone he wasn't supposed to. And that's where my ancestors came from. And they ended up here in the United States because life was untenable in Scotland. And they were blessed. Each of our litanies are going to be slightly different. Your faith story is different than mine. But it's important for each of us to remember where we came from and how we got where we are. And to allow that to inspire that generosity in us. And to know that whatever that story looks like, each of them is marked by one reliable and remarkable fact, whether we see it or not. And that is that God is always there. In the good times, in the bad times, in the wonders, and the pains in the whole story. God is there. And that makes all the difference. And so, when we remind ourselves of where we came from, we also remind ourselves that we are loved.